This is Chinese Chess Out Loud, and today I'm reviewing Chinese Chess, an introduction to China's ancient game of strategy. So I actually got this book as a Christmas present. I think my family knows that I like Chinese chess. Well, actually, it was on my Amazon wish list, and the reason it was on my Amazon wish list is it looked like a pretty decent introduction, and it has some good reviews. In fact, a bunch of these reviews are 5 stars, saying that it's easy to read, that it has good information for an absolute beginner. Sounds great. But the question is, does it live up to the hype? So I actually scanned in the book. That's why I've got it as loose pages right now, because I like to have things digitized as much as possible so I can search through them. So let's look at that. So first off, the introduction is just a couple pages. And this introduction talks about not the history of Xiangqi itself so much as the history of the writings about Xiangqi. So talks about some of the ancient manuals, and that's about it. Now, the first section of the book gives just a basic introduction to the board and the pieces. The first thing that I noticed that was interesting is that they call the black pieces, traditionally the black pieces in almost all the resources that I've looked at, they call them blue. So that throws me for a little bit of a loop as I'm reading this. Not horrible, but just something to be aware of. Almost all the other resources that I've encountered haven't used the term blue, they use black. Now, the next thing that's a little bit odd about this book is when they're explaining how pieces can move, they use letters to indicate different spaces on the board. So, for example, they've got these spaces indicated here, J, D, G, B, E, H, A, F, I. And then the author refers to them in the text as these are the locations that make up the palace. Now, what's a little confusing about this notation on the board is that these annotations for the space locations look an awful lot like pieces. So it's a little hard to tell whether some of these could be pieces or if these are all just spaces that are being denoted in the text. I think these are just spaces that the text refers to. But in any case, it looks a little bit confusing. I wish they had broken this up into a few more diagrams where instead of showing these spaces, they could use some arrows to draw, here's where the horse can go to, and then split it up with a separate diagram that says, but if there's a piece, as shown in this example, like a piece here in Y, then the horse cannot go to E. So I think that would have made it just a little bit more clear. This is kind of confusing to look at. But once you get through that, I mean, this is all just like the super basic introduction, like how does the elephant move, things like that. Then there's a little bit of information about the rules of play, about perpetual checks, things like that. And then a bit of discussion about the values of the pieces. And I think the Wikipedia page on Xiangqi in English actually pulls directly from this book. So here's the Wikipedia page, and then they say these are approximate values. And they reference the same author. I guess it's not the same book, but it's from the same author. And again, I'm not really a fan of these diagrams where the space notations look like pieces. It just kind of confuses me. The arrows are just not drawn very thickly on here, so they're a little difficult to see. I think this could have been annotated a little bit better. But one thing I really don't like about this book for modern Xiangqi beginners is that it uses an old notation system that I think tries to cater to Western chess players, but it creates a disconnect with the existing literature on Xiangqi. For example, we've got N3, F2, which means knight on line 3 forward to line 2. And at first it's a touch confusing because you might think that F might mean row F instead of forward, or B means backwards in this case. But in any case, the notation that's used in this book is a little bit different from that used on Xiangqi.com. For example, canon 2 to 5 is written as C2 equals 5. So they'll use symbol here instead of letters to indicate the motion. It's essentially the same thing, but a lot of the English-based sources that I've seen use something a little closer to Xiangqi.com's method. So I'm not sure if studying this book and using its notation is going to really set you up as a beginner to be super functional in the world of Xiangqi, or if it's going to cause some confusion. Also, I should have noted that in the book, it uses counselor for the advisors and minister for the elephant, which I understand you can translate those characters differently, and these are probably valid translations. But again, it is a disconnect for me when I go and look at Xiangqi.com, which would use A for the advisors and B for the elephants, B as in bishop in a way. So once you get past the basic rules and a notation system, then there's a section on playing the game. They've got some information about openings here, so central canon openings. And one of my biggest problems with this is it's just pure text. There's no diagrams to accompany openings. So to learn this, I've got to go study, I've got to get a diagram and make these moves. And it also seems a little bit sparse. There's just not that much information. It's literally just a couple pages on openings. And then they move into the mid-game, which is literally just a couple pages on the mid-game. Not much actual information or commentary here. There's just a lot of lists of some different scenarios. And then we get to the end game, and this is definitely the bulk of the book. And I guess that makes sense because typically end games are taught first. For beginners, that's the main focus. But I'll be honest here and say that the end game section of this book also kind of lets me down. There's not a ton of commentary. It's just a lot of examples of some endgame scenarios where they say, if it's configured in this orientation, then it will result in a draw. And you as the reader have to go through and figure out, I guess, why that's the case. So for example here, one cannon and two pawns can always defeat one cannon. And then there's a list of moves here, which is going to be a big pain to figure out. I would much prefer that this was in a software or a video format that I can see these moves happen to see why does one cannon and two pawns always defeat one cannon. But I understand this book was written in, 1983 or something, and some of those features were not available. This was the format of how you can present this information. But I think for a modern day Xiangqi learner, there's some better options available. And this mode of learning this particular content doesn't appeal to me. If I'm going to be learning Xiangqi from a book, I would much prefer there be a lot more explanatory comments and conversation about some of the techniques, sort of walk me through the thought process a little more. And then we get to the mid-game and end-game exercises. This is just a bunch of puzzles where they say, in this case, it's going to result in a win for red, and this one, it's going to be a draw. And on the back of the book, it advertises this as, it includes 80 mid and end-game exercises designed to sharpen playing skills. All right. The honest reality here is, no, it won't. I bet that the people who left 5-star reviews on this book did not actually work through this, because this is a painful way to work through Xiangqi examples. So again, for a new beginner, I don't think this is going to be too particularly helpful. I think if you want end-game puzzles and exercises, it's much more effective to use an app like Xiangqi.com or Tiantian Xiangqi and do some of the puzzles. On Tiantian Xiangqi, you can pick end-game puzzles that are in particular categories. So for example, in the puzzle section, we can work specifically on mate in one moves. And if we want, we can control the difficulty of those. Once we've mastered the mate in one moves, we can move to mate in 2, 3. We can look at the octagonal horse layouts, and there's a whole series of puzzles to choose from. I just think that this is a far superior way to focus on learning endgame puzzles. Once you've learned the endgame puzzles, then you can work on mid-game tactics, and there's a whole series of categorizations for mid-game tactics as well. So personally, I think that this is probably a more effective way to engage with learning Xiangqi than to go through these puzzles in a book. But that's just me. Maybe other people disagree, and that's fine. So then we get answers to the exercises showing the list of moves. And honestly, I don't even know what to do with some of these. Like, it looks like there's 15 moves here for one of these puzzles. And was I really supposed to figure that out? For a beginner book, I'm just at a loss here. I don't know why they thought this was a good idea. This is supposed to be an introduction. and for an exercise to have a solution where there are a whole slew of moves, it just boggles my mind that this was approved for publication in an introductory book. It makes no sense to me. Okay, so after those exercises, then the remainder of the book, which is actually a good and solid chunk of it, I'll just show you here. It's almost half the book, is these ancient manuals. And I think there's a little bit of controversy about how useful the ancient manuals are for beginners. I don't really know who this book was written for, to be honest. If it's for a brand new beginner, which I thought it was, I would expect some more commentary. I would expect something to be telling me what's special about these particular games. Why is this one surprising? And instead, we just get the move list. And to me, this feels, I don't know if lazy is the right word, because maybe it was a lot of work to translate all of these ancient manuals into this particular notation. It's at best, I think, misguided to assume that this is going to be useful for the Western audience where Xiangqi does not exist. It just doesn't in most of the Western world. So I think what's needed for someone like me is a lot more hand-holding. What we're looking at right here is how a lot of the Xiangqi literature in China is. And it makes sense because a lot of the actual learning that takes place for Xiangqi learners in China happens more socially because people are playing and they grow up playing with their parents and with their uncles, cousins, and friends. It's a part of daily life and culture to grow up learning and playing. And so then when you want to go learn more about Xiangqi and want to really up your game, then you go get a book. And the books don't do all the hand-holding because all that hand-holding was done in the social environment. So the books skip all of that and just present the more interesting challenges as lists of moves with minimal commentary. But I don't think that is useful for someone like me who is brand new to the game, approaching it and wanting to engage, especially in the 21st century, where we have things like YouTubers like Gotham Chess, for example, producing a lot of engaging content that explains the moves and walks through the logic of moves and some of the tactics, maybe in a more exciting way. This, I think, just falls short. And like I said, it's a significant portion of the book, like almost half the book was just these move lists. I'm not going to go through these from this book. I will be engaging with the ancient manuals, but in a different way. So for example, back in Tiantian Xiangqi, they do have some of the ancient manuals here, and they have some commentary associated with them. So if we look at a game here, there's some information. I have to do the translation, but there is information about the game and about some of the moves, about what makes this interesting or surprising. And an advantage of doing this in an app, for example, as opposed to a book, is that you can go forward and backwards. You can see it visually. And I think because chess is such a visual game, I think that's important. And then on top of that, you can run the analysis software to see from a bigger picture perspective visually how this game went. So again, this is from an ancient manual, and we can see where the decisive move was. That black made a blunder that produced a mate in 7 for red, and then from then on, red made the perfect best moves to execute on that mate in 7, which is impressive. It's an ancient manual. They didn't have the analysis tools that we have now, so recognizing a mate in 7 and getting it right, pretty cool. But one of the things that I would go look at is trying to understand, why is this pawn move a blunder? So what was the intent behind it? What would black be trying to do? And then why was it bad? And going back to the book, we have nothing here. We have no explanation. It's just the list of moves. And you've got 2 different ancient manuals in here. Anyway, so unfortunately, my review of this book is pretty negative. I should just add the disclaimer. I hopefully made it clear that I'm coming from a very specific point of view here, which is a Westerner interested in Chinese chess, but has zero background in Chinese chess. What resources are available? Does this help me move forward. This book, I don't think it really does. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be getting as much value out of this as I'd hoped. And I'll be looking for more resources to engage with and progress further on my journey. And I'll share those along the way. So if this was useful, drop a like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.